What it do, divine feminine? Y'all know me, the GOAT, Empress Goddess herself, the Georgia Peach. I always tell y'all I'm not gonna go live again, but hey, it is what it is. This is for my divine feminine. Divine feminine, where you at? Come on, let's get it.
I'm William Henry, and this is Ascension Keepers. Just imagine if suddenly all you believed about higher consciousness, ascension, and your potential as a spiritual being was ripped away from you and forbidden by the decree of a king or a dictator. Then you were exiled to a foreign land and told that you could never again see your home or practice your wisdom tradition. This happened to the predecessors of the Essenes during the purge of King Josiah in 586 BC, and is a pivotal moment in the timeline of the Ascension Keepers and in our own ascension. After this event, soul groups like the Essenes, Gnostics, and Cathars were labeled heretics by Orthodox or mainstream religion. In actuality, they were more like reactionaries. They weren't dissenters, as the term heresy suggests. They merely sought to retain or recover the original wisdom tradition, which included teachings about ascension brought to earth by celestial beings that the Orthodox religions replaced and labeled as heresy. In this episode, we will reveal the lost and secret history of this purge to see how this became the motivating incident, the necessary backstory for the formation of the Essenes, and how this impacts our present day ascension program. Our story begins with the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, the ascension site for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Originally built by King Solomon in around 950 BC, this temple at the center of the world was based on a plan given to Solomon by his father, King David, by God. David brought the Ark of the Covenant to this site. The temple was to be the raised up place where the Ark would stay and where the Old Testament God Yahweh dwelled. It is said that Solomon built the temple by magical means. It sat on an artificial hill or holy mountain, a gigantic 37-acre platform actually called Moriah or Zion, the city of God or the place that God loves. And God is said to have named it Jerusalem, a name that means to teach peace. Moriah is called Eben HaShatayah, the foundation stone. According to Jewish tradition, God began the creation of the universe here. Even up to the Middle Ages, Jerusalem was shown on maps as the center of the world. The dust of Moriah is said to have been used to create Adam. And like all temples in the ancient Near East, Solomon's temple was the architectural embodiment of the cosmic mountain or the cosmic axis. It may not be coincidental that Moriah is phonetically similar to Meru, the cosmic axis of Tibetan Buddhism, and the root of Sumeru, where the Tower of Babel was located. The Essenes called the Temple of Solomon the Tower. In other words, it was a link between heaven and earth, with gods and divine beings coming and going, and humans ascending from this place. It was here that Abraham met with Melchizedek, a very powerful celestial being, and where Jacob had his dream of the ladder to heaven. Muhammad ascended from this place during the Miraj or night journey around the year 621 AD. Muhammad ascended into heaven with the angel Gabriel and met a different prophet at each of the 7 levels of heaven. First Adam, then John the Baptist and Jesus, then Joseph, then Idris, then Aaron, then Moses, and lastly, Abraham. King Solomon himself was one of the greatest magicians who ever lived. He received wisdom directly from God. Legend claims that he used the shamir, a worm or substance that had the power to cut through or disintegrate stone, iron, and diamond. Moses reputedly used the shamir to engrave the priestly breastplate stones that were inserted into the breastplate of the ascent. When the high priest emerged from the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple and sunlight hit the breastplate, its multicolored stones radiated rainbows. Because the symbols of the high priest's outfit, the crown, the robe, the rod of enlightenment, matched the crown, robe, and resurrection stick of the Tibetan rainbow light body tradition, I have proposed it is symbolic of the rainbow light body or perfect light body. This connection is key to understanding the goings-on in the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple and to what the Essenes were doing at Qumran and elsewhere. The name Moriah, the mount upon which the temple sat, actually comes from the root Raha, which means to see. It was the place where epiphanies, from the Greek epiphania, or apparition, or appearances or manifestations of divine beings took place. For over 300 years, these manifestations took place inside this temple. People saw God. He, or his throne, was described as luminous, radiating rainbow light. We will see this motif returning again and again in our exploration. This rainbow throne is clearly mobile. The depictions of thrones on Sumerian and Babylonian cylinder seals became the basis for Judeo-Christian images of God as a human on a throne in the stars. And when that throne landed, it did so in the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple. These appearances took place in the Holy of Holies of the temple, a golden, cube-shaped room with walls lined with gold and covered with images of palm trees. It was the Garden of Eden, or a recreation of the Garden of Eden. The shiny golden walls must have made it like being in a hall of mirrors. In temple mysticism, Dr. Margaret Barker describes it as a cube of fire, alive with fiery beings. The throne was flashing fire within a fiery cloud, and from the fire came the likeness of 4 living creatures. Ezekiel describes the Holy of Holies. Over this fire was a throne with a human figure upon it, and he too was fiery. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. On his heavenly journey, Enoch saw such fiery beings. They were like flaming fire and could take human form. They took me to a place in which those who were like flaming fire, and when they wished, they appeared as men, said Enoch. When the Temple of Solomon was operational, human high priests would enter the Holy of Holies by crossing over or through a veil of stars. This represented the border between the human and the divine realms. In other words, the Temple of Solomon was an intersection between heaven and earth where God, or the angels, materialized or appeared. Hence, it was a place to be with God and a source of salvation. This veil was what the Essenes termed the Raz Nahaya, or the mystery of existence or becoming, on which the wise were to meditate. This knowledge originated in the temple's Holy of Holies and was revealed to those who entered heaven and ascended. These people lived in harmony and resonance with creation, and they lived with angels. It's important to note the meaning of the word most holy. What this means is that the cube-shaped room and the objects therein, including the Ark of the Covenant, could transmit holiness and make anyone and anything that came into contact with this place holy. This is why access to this place was so important. It was also a place of ascension. Humans entering this cube-shaped room ascended to the heavenly realms. Clearly, we're talking about this place as a stargate, and it was in continuous operation for over 300 years until, in our ascension timeline, 2 key events now drive the story. One was the accession of King Josiah, a boy king, who came to the throne of Jerusalem in 640 BC and his purging of the temple in 623 BC. And the second event was the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, including the Temple of Solomon, and the exile of her people 4 decades later in 597 BC. As the book of Chronicles tells us, in 623 BC, during the 18th year of his reign, Josiah was refurbishing the Temple of Solomon, which the previous kings had neglected. During the restoration, a high priest named Hilkiah discovered a book, the Book of the Law, given to Moses. When Josiah discovered what he said, he summoned all the subjects of Jerusalem and Judah to the temple and read for them the new law. The new law book is called the Book of Deuteronomy, or the Book of the Covenant. It was received by Moses, we're told, in the burning bush. At its heart are the 10 Commandments, the laws of Yahweh. Deuteronomy's laws and ordinances were upheld as the new wisdom and understanding. It was completely different from the older wisdom tradition, which was now forbidden by Josiah. We can begin to understand this older wisdom tradition by following Josiah's actions. More than just a book of the law, Deuteronomy compelled Josiah to go on a rampage, destroying the shrines and the high places of worship, the Asherah and images, and removed their name from the land. Then he purged the temple. As we will see, the Asherah is the symbol of the divine feminine. Deuteronomy forbade alien religions, altars, pillars, ashrams, and images. All were to be destroyed, smashed, and burned. Worshipping celestial beings, the host of heaven, became a capital offense. Looking at the stars was also forbidden for fear the people would, once again, worship the host of heaven, the angelic beings. All forms of divination were outlawed. Punishment for disobedience was death by stoning. All of these practices were later observed by the Essenes, who claimed they were living with angels and were able to tell the future. At the core of the old tradition was the breastplate of the high priest. It was composed of 12 stones and contained the ephod. Inside the breastplate were 2 stones called Urim and Thummim. These stones were called lights and perfection, and it is the root of the name Essenes. The high priest would put on the breastplate when he entered the Holy of Holies to speak with the Lord. These stones were among 5 items that went missing during the time of Josiah and the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. The other items were the Ark of the Covenant, the flask of manna, the cruse of anointing oil, and the rod of enlightenment. All of these tools worked together. Returning to our timeline, in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, flattened its walls, stripped Solomon's temple of all its treasure, set the city ablaze, and returned home to Babylon with the treasure of the temple and a group of royal prisoners of war. The Greek 3rd century book of Ezra tells us that the Babylonians took all the holy vessels of the temple, both great and small, and the Ark of God, and the king's treasures, and carried them away to Babylon. Thousands of Jews were exiled to Babylon, including the prophets Daniel and Ezekiel. Nothing is said in the Bible about the Ark of the Covenant after the Jews returned from Babylon. The Apocrypha states that the Ark could not be found when the Jewish people rebuilt the temple at the time of Ezra and Zechariah. Deuteronomy mentions none of these items. The reason why is because they were associated with the original wisdom tradition of the divine feminine practiced by the Israelites at the Temple of Solomon. In Jewish tradition, all of these items will be recovered by her son, the Messiah, and returned to Jerusalem when the Temple of Solomon is built. This will occur, we are told, in the end times or Judgment Day. In their place was the closed and empty golden box they called the Ark of the Covenant, and stories that the empty box went to Ethiopia or elsewhere. If this ark were compared to a computer, it would be a screen minus the keyboard, mouse, power cord, and software. In other words, a useless piece of technology. This is why many researchers typically present the Ark of the Covenant as a golden box and do not mention its other components. They're just not aware of its history. But this was only the beginning of Josiah's changing of the gods. The mystic priests of the temple were evicted as they were considered unclean or blemished. These refugees fled to Egypt, where they built a copy of Solomon's temple at Elephantine Island. They are also believed to have fled to Arabia, Tibet, Russia, and China. One group who fled in particular catches our attention. They were called the Rechabites. While we may not be familiar with them, their story was widely known to the Essenes and in early Gnostic Christian ascension circles. Josiah tried to convert the Rechabites to the new law, but they refused. They were imprisoned, but they were set free by angels who took them to a paradise place where light was perpetual. There, the Rechabites lived with the angels and prayed for their brethren left on earth. Apparently, they were taken in flesh and blood form, as the story goes. When they died, the angels buried them in graves and took their souls in light body form up to heaven. The history of the Rechabites says they wore garments of glory or light, just like the light bodies of Adam and Eve before the fall. These are the light bodies we have been discussing and the object of the Essene quest. The name Rechabites means people of the chariot. Later, they were called the Nazorim, a word very similar to Nazarene, the Watchers. The chariot, for whom they were named, is believed to be the Merkabah, or chariot throne, that was present in the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple. This chariot throne is the primary symbol of the old-time ascension religion Josiah purged from the temple. The book of 2 Kings tells us explicitly that Josiah burned the chariots of the sun. These are the chariots of the gods, the Merkabah chariot of Elijah. Deuteronomy does not mention the golden chariot of the cherubim that the Lord told David to set in the temple. Perhaps it is another of the missing items that included the Ark of the Covenant, the rod of Aaron, the flask of manna, and the jar of anointing oil. It was the Essenes who called this chariot the Merkabah throne chariot. They remembered it. It was during the Babylonian exile that mystical books like 3 Enoch were collected. These books describe the chariot throne and are therefore known as Merkabah texts. This story is important as it matches precisely the community rule of the Essenes, who sought this very throne, plus the crown and the robe. Ezekiel, the tragedian, shares the name of a high priest of the Temple of Solomon, Ezekiel, which means he knew about the workings of the temple. We are told in a book that bears his name that Ezekiel was near the banks of the river Chebar on July 28, 593 BC, when suddenly a whirlwind, a great cloud with brightness about it, appeared. Inside the cloud were 4 living creatures. He sees wheels within wheels that have the ability to fly. Above them was a throne, and on the throne was the likeness of a man. Ezekiel describes the being on the throne as something that seemed like human form. Ezekiel saw the chariot throne leaving the Temple of Solomon. He saw first that a cloud filled the inner court of the temple, and then that this was the brightness of the glory of the Lord. As the chariot arrived in Babylon, Ezekiel saw a great cloud approaching with brightness all around. The brightness was like a rainbow in a rain cloud, and in the midst of the bright cloud, said Ezekiel, was a fiery human form. The throne moved in a cloud. In his vision, which is often cited as an ancient UFO encounter, Ezekiel is given a vision of a new Temple of Solomon. And Ezekiel's story can easily be illustrated with Tibetan art. Ezekiel saw the chariot throne in its glory returning from the east to the temple, exactly as he had seen it depart, and it was returning to the rebuilt temple. The rainbow was the sign of the everlasting covenant mentioned in the book of Genesis. The rainbow around the chariot throne was the sign and seal of the original old-time wisdom tradition that was replaced by the book of Deuteronomy. This vision, which is at the core of the book of Ezekiel, became another key teaching of the Merkabah mystics, especially the Essenes. While the word chariot is not used in Ezekiel's account, mystics assume that he is speaking of the chariot of the gods. And while some might interpret this as a hardware spaceship, the Essenes knew that it was composed of consciousness. Importantly, the celestial chariot is also referred to as the sacred boat. And these Merkabah mystics claim to be able to duplicate Ezekiel's experience of ascending to the heavens in this chariot or sailing the stars in this boat. In addition to Ezekiel, they favored Enoch, one of the founders of the Essenes, as a way-shower. Before Moses, the Jews, including Ezekiel, focused their religion on Enoch and his books, which tell how angels and righteous ones initiated humans in the secrets of heaven. Enoch is a mysterious pre-flood figure who is mentioned only once in the Old Testament. It says he walked with God, which many assume to mean he was taken bodily into heaven. The Essenes made a sort of a superhero out of him, telling in detail how he was the first translated man, the first man raised from human to an angel. In fact, he was transformed into the great angel Metatron, whose name means next to the throne. In one episode, told in 1st Enoch, we are told the archangel Michael came and took Enoch to heaven. Along the way, he anointed his body with an oil that dissolved Enoch's body into rainbow-colored light so that it matched the light bodies of the angels. And in Christian art, Michael is shown wearing peacock wings. The iridescent peacock's feathers feature all of the colors of the rainbow and are symbolic of the light body of the angels. Enoch's ascension story not only told the Essenes and others what to do, but how to do it. Get on the radar of Michael and the other angels and find this oil. This is the anointing oil kept in the Ark of the Covenant. Importantly, John the Revelator saw the rainbow around the throne. And when he saw the mighty angel coming from heaven with his little scroll, he was wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow around his head. Scholars like Dr. Margaret Barker observed that Josiah's destruction of the older wisdom tradition, the ascension tradition, was more devastating than even the loss of Solomon's temple itself. In contemporary terms, we may say that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the hardware of the temple, but Josiah deleted or attempted to delete the software of the temple and its vital code. It was a dismantling of the original ascension teachings. What this means is that there was another wisdom tradition practiced in Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon before it was destroyed. It was this religion that the Essenes later tried to recover and revive. It is the ascension tradition of Enoch, Ezekiel, and all the ascension keepers. It is based on the teachings of the angels, who are rainbow light beings. It was also during this period between Josiah's purge and the destruction of the temple that the Queen of Heaven was abandoned. Josiah dispatched the angels from Jerusalem and centralized power in his hands. 1st Enoch tells how the Jews worshiped the Queen of Heaven. Images portrayed her as an angelic-like figure with wings. Deuteronomy forbade even looking up to the heavens, lest people worship these angels. And some believe it was because of the abandonment of the divine feminine that Jerusalem was lost. This version of history is also found in the Essenes Damascus document, which was the work of the refugee priests. The Damascus document makes clear that the priests returning to the rebuilt Temple of Solomon during the time of the Essenes were not from the original ascension wisdom tradition. Instead, they were Josiah's priests, if you will. They rebuilt the Temple of Solomon, and the Essenes had a problem with it and the way they were running things. They wanted their old-time wisdom tradition. They wanted their ascension teachings. After the destruction of the Essenes, these same Josiah priests, if you will, were responsible for rewriting Hebrew history and calling the Essenes heretics. In fact, all those who remembered the ascension wisdom teachings were labeled as heretics. We can begin to recover this spiritual tradition and early wisdom teachings by accounting for the items Josiah purged from the temple and or destroyed. We mentioned the Ark of the Covenant. But foremost is the Asherah, the symbol of the goddess Asherah, who is presented as an alien entity closely linked to the host of heaven. Asherah was the wife of El, the head of the Canaanite pantheon, and probably the mother of the gods in Canaanite and later Jewish tradition. Some literary evidence in ancient Israel even speaks of Asherah as the consort of the Old Testament God Yahweh himself. The removal of the Asherah, the symbol of this goddess, and its destruction is described in detail. Josiah took it to the Valley of Kidron, burned it, beat it to dust or powder, and spread it over the common graves. When Josiah destroyed the Asherah, he also broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes who were in the house of the Lord, the Temple of Solomon, where the women wove hangings for the Asherah. These cult prostitutes were actually angels, the women who wove the linen clothing of the angels. We can trace the Asherah to Egypt in the form of Hathor, who was called the Queen of Heaven and who was crowned with the moon. The Asherah poles are likely the same as the Hathor pillars of Egypt, especially those at Hathor's temple at Dendera, the temple of love and joy in Dendera. Dendera is the Greek name for the Egyptian Canteret, which means she of the divine pillar. That name is a reference to the Tet pillar, this device or world tree Hathor is Asherah, says the scholar William Deaver and other archaeologists, echoing a long-known fact known in goddess circles. In fact, he calls her Hathor Asherah, and on an Egyptian plaque, she is listed as Kedushu, Hathor, Asherah, Anat, and Astarte. They are all the same goddess. Khudshu is the Egyptian form of the word Kadesh, or Kadeshet. It means feminine holy one, or holiness in Hebrew, Canaanite, and Egyptian. In 1967, Raphael Patai was the first historian to mention that the ancient Israelites worshipped both Yahweh and Asherah. In his book, The Hebrew Goddess, he calculated that the statue of Asherah was present in the Temple of Solomon for no less than 236 years, 2/3 of the time the Solomonic Temple stood in Jerusalem. This worship, he asserts, was part of the legitimate religion approved and led by the king, the court, and the priesthood. King Solomon assuredly knew who or what Asherah denoted and of its origins in Egypt. And as Josiah learned, striking this goddess from the Israelite mind was not easy. The image of the Asherah would not go away, nor would the quest for ascension. What we have just learned from this incredible historical investigation is that there was once an alternative, a parallel mystery tradition based on the idea of human ascension, that it had its focus place at the Temple of Solomon, and that it was ultimately lost. This had the effect, in a way, of knocking humanity off its timeline. It's as if we knew for a very long time that our destiny was to ascend, that we had an understanding of the hosts of heaven, of extraterrestrial beings, and of angels who were here to assist us. But then there was this changing of the gods, for whatever reason, and perhaps it has a benevolent purpose. We lost our connection to these stellar beings, to these star beings, and this understanding of our quest for perfection. Inserted in its place was a religion that has certainly benefited hundreds of millions of people. But within these religions of Judaism and Christianity, there are always these references to the old-time mysteries and to the mysteries of ascension. And the value in going on this quest is that we can reorient the human species. We can bring it back to its original ascension timeline, reach into the stars, and achieve our fullest destiny.
Representing a battle between Enki and Enlil for the control over the human race?
What the Mesopotamian story tells us, that Enki introduced contention into human speech. And there are biblical scholars who think that that was
evolutionary biology by starting at the branches of the family tree and finding the root. Their goal was to figure out if all the languages in the world derived from the same area. In an interview with NPR, Quentin explained how they gathered this data.
What we use are what are called cognates. These are words that show similar forms that indicates that they're related via common ancestry. Over 6,000 across the 200 meanings in 100 languages. And from that, we can build, it's our data matrix, we call it, And so if you imagine down the left-hand side of the data matrix, you've got all your languages, and then along the top of the data matrix, you've got all the possible cognates that we've identified, and you fill in that matrix by putting a 0 if that language has doesn't have the cognate, and a 1 if the language does have that cognate. And if you fill that in for all the cognates, you get a sequence of 1s and 0s for each language. And it's a bit like having a sequence of DNA for each language. And that's the data that we then input into our analysis.
Through their research, they pinned down the 8 millennia old origin of the largest global language ever created. They also determined all of these languages began in one area.
There are 2 competing theories for where these languages came from. The first theory was put forward by Maria Gimbutas, an archaeologist, and she argued the languages spread out from the Russian steppes region about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, and that's linked to archaeological evidence for an expansion at that time. The alternative theory is that the languages spread much earlier from Anatolia, what is now Turkey.
This interesting study done by Atkinson relates to an ancient story about the Tower of Babel in the Hebrew Bible. In Genesis 11, 1 through 9, it states, "Everyone on earth once spoke the same language. As people migrated east, they settled in the land of Shinar."
For those who are not familiar with it, the Tower of Babel is a biblical story about the idea of a group of people who are all centered in their civilization around a tower, and that this tower somehow allowed them to have all the same language and to all be able to speak to one another. Then the legend reports that there was some sort of destruction of the tower, and in this aftermath of this happening, that the people themselves were scattered and they no longer could speak the same tongue or the same language, and thus we became confused. It's sort of like a fall from grace type story. You have to understand that there is a very significant difference between how the scholarship on the ancient civilizations is seen in the open, unclassified world, as opposed to how it is being seen within the secret government and the military-industrial complex. They are going back and they are looking at every single mythology that they could find, and they're asking very important questions which need to have scientific answers. One of the questions is, what in the world was the Tower of Babel? They have started to learn that no matter what the ancient mythology is, you dig deep enough, you double click on it, and you find out, wait a minute, there's something here that suggests this is not a myth. So it's very interesting to note that in 1899, in the town of Sippar, there was a very interesting stone tablet that was found right near where Babylon was originally located. And it actually has an X marks the spot treasure map type derivation of the location of the Tower of Babel, allegedly. Now, what's interesting about that is that the Tower of Babel X marks the spot location is up in Turkey.
This possibly new understanding of where the Tower of Babel was located coincides nicely with Anton Parks's research of the Garden of Eden and the understanding of the language according to Sumerian texts.
Donc cette localisation de cette fameuse montagne divine. We were able to locate the divine mountain of the Anuna gods along with their Garden of Eden, thanks to the elements found with Google Earth and Gary Zeitling from NASA. It took us straight to eastern Turkey, close to Road 5651. What can be noted in the Sumerian tablets, when they clearly speak of creating workers to serve the Anunas, the main geneticist is always Enki. Enki is very proud of what he is doing. However, he always has to do it in secret. And here something important occurs in the research that I've carried out. In order to be able to secretly teach values, aside from changing their genetic code, in which he probably injected things that we cannot comprehend nowadays, the gods were using a specific language in Eden, the Emion language, the language that comes from the skies, the language which comes from On. In my years of research, I understood that the Emeshah, the matrix language, was mostly used by Sumerian priestesses. The so-called Emeshah contained more particles than the languages used by the male gods. So Enki used the Emeshah, the matrix language, to encode the ancient languages we find on Earth. I think that Enki had the desire to work for the benefit of the human race, to secretly bring them knowledge. And to be able to do that, they had to use a code. So they created a linguistic code for each tribe. And I think that regularly, maybe every generation, they had to change the code to prevent the Anunas from finding out about the hidden knowledge.
It is interesting to note that according to Anton's research, the language that has been coded into the universe for the humans to speak is called the matrix language. In Sumerian, this means the language that the female life creators, like Tiamat, spoke. How has this coded language helped us survive against the wrath of the demiurge?
This is a crucial part of my work. I discovered that all common languages were coded from Sumerian. We can look for idioms from anywhere we want. African tribes, Native American tribes, all the way to China. When you get to the innermost part of primitive languages, you can always understand the words in Sumerian. For example, if you take the word tool in the language of an African tribe and you translate it into Sumerian, it will become the thing we use to chop wood. The idea is a code used in order to be able to communicate secretly with humans. In concrete terms, This idea of coding language and creating new ones with Sumerian syllables, this desire to be able to communicate secretly with the human race, is going to design the many different languages on Earth. Old Chinese, the Hopi, many of the ancient idioms we find in Africa or in Australia. We can find common roots with ancient German and ancient English. Enki knew for a fact that human beings would not be submissive to the gods on the whole planet. So he gifted them with the ability to make tools, and in my theory, he also wished to code human language so the gods could not understand.
Anton Park suggests that once the humans had the knowledge to survive on Earth, they sought to build their own future and escape the gods. Could there be an actual builder of this new human settlement? In the Hebrew Bible, it suggests that the builder of the Tower of Babel was the king of Shinar, and his name was Nimrod. What an interesting name for someone who defies the laws of Yahweh to create his own connection to the Creator. Could Nimrod have been the representation of the first group of humans to use the knowledge taught by Enki?
Nimrod, interesting character. He was said to have built the Tower of Babel. He went up against God himself, tried to get closer than anybody else had ever done. As a result, God struck down the Tower of Babel, and as a punishment to humanity for having attempted this act, confused the languages so that everybody couldn't understand everybody else. Is there anything more behind this story? Is there something of importance? Well, what is the Tower of Babel? The Babylonian civilization is focused around Babylon, and Babylon is in Lower Iraq. They now see this area as the center of reality, the center of everything. This is the Omphalos, the axis mundi, the axis of the earth. That gravitational shift from northern Mesopotamia to southern Mesopotamia was the result of the Babylonians. This is why the ancient city of Erech is in southern Iraq, when all the old accounts say that it was the ancient name for Urfa in southeast Turkey. This is why Nimrod is associated now with Babylon and not with southeast Turkey.
The biblical story of Nimrod and his area of proposed reign happened to be in the same area that a group of ancient astrologers once resided. This group was called the Chaldeans. Could this ancient group have been practicing some of the ancient teachings by Enki?
Urfa was the stronghold of Nimrod. This was the traditional homeland of the Chaldeans. They were star worshippers. They recorded stars. They had knowledge of comets, knowledge of eclipses and everything like this. They were the scientists of their day. So what Abraham is trying to do is knock down their beliefs, their ideas, their mystery tradition, and install this new idea. So it is possible that what he was trying to do is to essentially kill off the wisdom tradition that had been that of the Chaldeans up to this point, and that Nimrod somehow steps in, whoever or whatever he represents, to try and prevent this from happening. But unfortunately, according to the legends, God intervenes, saves Abraham, and that's essentially the story. So yes, there is something in this. I do accept that what Abraham was trying to do is, bring in a new era that didn't need our connection with the stars. But what the implications of that is for Judaism or even Christianity, I don't know.
Could this battle between Abraham and Nimrod really be representing a battle between Enki and Enlil for the control over the human race?
What the Mesopotamian story tells us that Enki introduced contention into human speech. And there are biblical scholars who think that that was the basis then of the Tower of Babel story. Now, what's interesting though is earlier Enki was said to be the provider of wisdom. He was said to have been the one who wanted humanity to have the knowledge that would undo the gods or the control of the gods. So we have this kind of conflict now in the Mesopotamian stories. People who have really studied the Mesopotamian stories, and we're talking very good biblical scholars and Mesopotamian scholars, they're so ambivalent about the Enki figure. They say, yeah, he was said to be this great guy. He sometimes is identified with the snake in the Garden of Eden, and then he later became identified with Prometheus in the Greek version of the story, where Prometheus tries to come down and give humanity this certain knowledge that would advance them. And then the other gods come in and say, no, you can't do that. And then there are all these repercussions to humanity in dividing them up. The people in the Tower of Babel story were really anarchists who were opposing the archons. And they were saying, the heck with the archons, we're leaving, we're going to establish our own little anarchy, and we're going to move over here and build our own city, and we're going to go do things on our own.
And what was it that they were going to do their way? Just 8 miles north of the ancient city of Urfa is another famous site known as Göbekli Tepe. All that is revealed is the top of what could have been a great tower of sorts. 95% of the site remains below ground to be uncovered. Could the ancient humans have gathered here to use their knowledge of the universe?
Göbekli Tepe is the oldest stone circle complex in the world. If you can imagine Stonehenge in England and transpose it onto the top of a mountaintop in southeast Turkey, and then multiply it by at least 20 times, and then cover the stones with beautiful carvings of animals and representations of abstract humans, and give them T-shaped tops. The fact is that Göbekli Tepe is in northern Mesopotamia. This is clearly the cradle of civilization in this area. This is where the Neolithic Revolution began. This is where even the archaeologist Klaus Schmidt at Göbekli Tepe, who discovered the site, suggests that the Anunnaki had their power base. It's clearly that a lot of things started here.
A site only becomes sacred upon the foundations of many, many old temples. Göbekli Tepe is one great example. It's an entire artificial hill. The clue is actually in the name, the original name. It means Potbelly Hill, or the Hill of the Navel in its true context, which to me tells me that it's a navel of the earth. And like so many other navels of the earth around the world, it's a place where the rules of physics work in a certain way that allows you communication with other levels of reality.
The whole evolution of language in the human Homo sapiens sapien brain has been cultivated, manipulated, and managed by technologies that could influence the human brain's development of language. And that when we read about the Tower of Babel being a time when the human population had one language, had one thought system, if it's true that there have been competing geopolitical territorial forces and competing non-humans on this planet, and that there was a time when humans were unified, that would not have been a good step for the competing non-humans. And it could very well be the Tower of Babel story was one of those moments where humans had been homogenized and something did not want that homogeneity in human thought, humans together, humans working as a group. And that from the outside, there was a disruption in what for just a brief moment may have been a unification in thought without war or conflict of human beings.
Unification, a dangerous thing to have if you plan to rule over a people. But could this unification have been an actual tower, or just an ancient location where people gathered to exchange knowledge? A location in which they could communicate important information.
Babylon is actually an old Sumerian word which means gate of God, which for me, my understanding of the ancient mysteries tells me everything I need to know. Anything referred to as a gate of God or a navel of the earth is usually a sort of an energetic hotspot where the laws of physics are slightly different, or just so, that allows you to step through a portal into another level of existence. For me, the Tower of Babel essentially represents the levels of attainment of knowledge that gets you to rise slowly ever upwards towards the mind of God. The summit, of course, being the connection or the interchange between the physical and the non-physical. The way that they communicated in the old days was through metaphor, and the more we get into the historical era, the more we mistake the metaphor for reality.
In one of the traditions, Enlil just gets really annoyed because of the noise humanity is making. And that just noise is too much. Let's just get rid of these horrible little things. But Enki doesn't want to go that route. Humanity are his creatures, and his project is to bring wisdom and understanding to humanity. And I think there's a beautiful message hidden beneath that symbolism.
Some experts like Jack Carey believe the story of the Tower of Babel is not just the location that offered a gateway to the gods, but a location that humans created, a frequency that could defy the current reality.
I believe absolutely that the Tower of Babel was a center where humans were being taught divine knowledge, and chief among those secrets was the power of the spoken word, and that they were being taught a language which was forbidden by the leadership of this extraterrestrial intelligence to teach them. Imagine a species that has developed a language that is so potent that it literally uses the laws of harmonic resonance in order to create instantaneous change in your surroundings. That's what they were being taught. And it was strictly forbidden. That the leadership looked down and said, what, you're teaching this invention of ours, how to use the most potent weapon that we have, which is our speech, to create change. How is that going to turn out? You know, and this battle between Enki and Enlil that are claimed to have been in charge of the planet may have been the result of why that center was actually destroyed. At some point, Enlil was very, very irritated with the fact that humans were being taught all of these things. These secrets were all considered to be forbidden. Chief among those is the secret of the language that allows you to create change in reality at will. The construction of words using syllables that exhibit frequencies that can literally cause a stone to float in midair by speaking a word. That's the kind of power that they possessed. Sound causes change in your surroundings because of its natural relationship with the rest of creation. A word is no less valuable in creation than a rock sitting there. They were all created by the same laws. And the fact that you're able to make a sound is something that is a universal present. Let's call it that. It was bestowed upon us by the creator of this entire universe. It's almost as though not only is every single physical object in our reality connected with all of this, but yes, because we're a creation of the same thing, we're able to make these vibrations with our bodies. And in some occult groups, they call them barbarous names of incantations. They have all of these different sacred words that supposedly if you speak, let's say in a ceremony, it will cause a particular kind of change. That's tied into this whole idea of harmonic resonance, and our bodies vibrate to these same frequencies, and therefore our words vibrate to the same frequencies. So yeah, it's all tied together in one big, beautiful universe.
If the humans were able to control matter by using a language that changed frequency, could Göbekli Tepe have been used to harness this frequency?
I think of Göbekli Tepe. I think of other monuments that were purposely buried, maybe because they were too powerful, maybe because the creatures that built them didn't want us to destroy ourselves with that technology. And maybe those areas, if you go deep enough, have the kind of rock strata necessary in order to cause these vibrational frequencies to occur.
Is it possible that Enki tried to unify the ancient humans through knowledge, but in order to survive the wrath of Enlil, humans had to scatter throughout the globe using their coded cognates? Are these the same cognates that Atkinson has been piecing together?
When we look at the ancient descriptions of the Tower of Babel, for me, I look at it as a scientist from the physical evidence. The common theme that weaves them together when they talk about the tower is that it was a warning to humankind of our use of knowledge.
Some experts like Jonathan Young believe our path to returning to unification is an individual journey.
Let me speak to guilt for a moment, that leaving these paradise stories was our fault, leaving the Garden of Eden or the fall of the Tower of Babel, that we had something good that we messed up through our mistake. This is psychotherapy 101. This is blaming ourselves for something that was larger than we were. To distribute people around in different geographical locations with different languages speaks to the diversity of humanity, and in a way is respectful that there are many different cultures. This is, on an individual level, what is called the polyvocal quality of psychology. We have many energies, desires, agendas, voices, and we're struggling to pull that all together. This is personal work. Collectively, we have many voices in a community or in a nation. After all, there probably isn't just one path to transcendence. There are as many as there are seekers, and this is a story of the many.
But actually, I think the ancient Egyptians touched on a fundamental truth, which is each one of us, every minute of every day, are constantly making choices between good and evil. They may be very small choices. In some cases, if you're dealing with a president of a major nation, that person's choices between good and evil may have huge implications for everybody else, but we're all playing the same game. We're all having to make those choices, and those choices add up to the structure of our lives.
Could this structure have been coded in our universe and in our language to help us understand our purpose? Reporter Linda Moulton Howe believes that whatever the humans had tapped into at Göbekli Tepe, they knew that they had something powerful. They had to hide it and disappear.
Whoever built Göbekli Tepe, the fact that they buried that very important 30 acres of these rings of all of these limestone columns meant something knew that something potentially destructive to the whole planet. That's the key. Potentially destructive to the whole planet. And they didn't want Göbekli Tepe destroyed.
Could certain humans have buried Göbekli Tepe because a bigger catastrophe was about to happen that would wipe out any trace of this knowledge?
Then comes the flood. The cataclysm wipes everything out, but that knowledge persists through the flood. And after the flood, they are again offering the gifts of civilization to mankind.
Up next, was the flood the next attempt to destroy the knowledge of the gods? On December 7th, 2001, a news article on the BBC boasted, "Lost City Found Beneath Cuban Waters." This exciting news came from a team of explorers headed by Pauline Zalitsky, a marine engineer, and her husband, Paul Weinswig. Their company worked side by side with the Cuban government to try to uncover hundreds of treasure-laden ships from the Spanish colonial era. What they uncovered using their advanced sonar equipment was far more mysterious.
According to what they reported, Weinswig and Zalitsky had made a deal with Fidel Castro in order to do side-scan sonar readings of the seafloor around Cuba. They were looking for sunken Spanish treasure galleons in order to have gold that might be found. The gold would then be split 50-50 between them and Cuba, and nobody else had gotten these rights before, so it was very exciting. When they used the sonar on the seabed, what they found was not sunken gold. They found incredible architectural monuments down there, and these monuments were specifically located off the western tip of Cuba, about a half-mile below sea level, in very harsh ocean currents that make it almost impossible to have anything go down there except for some of the best submersibles. What they saw was these side-scan sonar readings that were pyramid-like buildings, long roads, all kinds of clearly megalithic stone architecture, and what we hear from some of the original reports was that they signed an exclusive deal with National Geographic magazine, that this whole story was going to go public in the summer of 2003, and well, that obviously did not happen. In the meantime, Pauline Zalitsky was leaking information about those discoveries that they were revealing, and according to Zalitsky's reports, she was using a submersible and saw that there were sphinxes down there, and that there were bizarre inscriptions on the stones. And remember, we're dealing with something that could not have possibly been above sea level for at least 11,000 years. She had submersible footage of a pyramid down there that has kind of a change in the slope angle as it goes halfway up, kind of similar to the pyramid of Djoser in Egypt. So we're seeing a direct relationship between these monuments and what we see in Egypt. That to me is astonishing because it suggests that the Egyptian pyramids as well may have been built at the same time and are therefore far older than the assumptions of conventional archaeology. There it is right down there. It's obviously artificial, and then the whole story somehow got suppressed.
Zalitsky estimated that it would have taken over 11,000 years for such a structure to have sunken to the depth at which these structures were said to be found. Strangely, after they released their findings, the news outlets and networks went dark. What might they have stumbled upon?
When we talk about submerged cities, we're lending credibility to the emerging evidence of cyclic civilization. The question is, how far back do those civilizations go? First, they appear to occur in 5,000-year cycles. The historic context of civilizations going back 50, 60, 70,000 years along these 5,000-year cycles shows up in the mythology. Maybe the mythology is based on much more fact than we've been led to believe in the past, or we've been willing to embrace in the past.
If this structure underneath the ocean floor sank possibly 11,000 years or more ago, could this be a link to the infamous Atlantis?
Atlantis is almost a catch-all term for trying to find the origins of civilization itself. This probably goes back to the 19th century when the US congressman by the name of Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book that was to become the seminal work on Atlantis. It was entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And in here, what he proposed was that all of the civilizations of the ancient world and the New World, the Americas, had a mother civilization as its source. All of the information that's been left to us on Atlantis by Plato, the Greek philosopher who wrote around 350 BC, suggests that we should be looking for Atlantis somewhere in the area of the Bahamas and the Caribbean. But because of Ignatius Donnelly's ideas to do with a mother civilization, Atlantis therefore becomes this concept more than an actual drowned city. I believe that Atlantis existed. I believe that a high culture probably peopled those massive islands of the Bahamas and the Caribbean, and they may well have been drowned and destroyed in the Great Cataclysm, the so-called Younger Dryas event.
I think I need to explain the Younger Dryas. Let's first of all consider the world during the Ice Age. Everybody's heard of the Ice Age. What was the Ice Age? The last Ice Age set in about 125,000 years ago. And it saw the buildup of giant ice caps, primarily on top of North America and on top of Northern Europe. Exactly why the Ice Age happened is still a subject that scientists argue about. But it's not in dispute that an ice cap 2 miles deep sat on top of North America and a huge area of Northern Europe, that same 2 mile deep ice cap. It reaches its maximum extent about 21,000 years ago. The temperatures are warming almost actually to modern levels. And the ice is beginning to disappear. And then suddenly, 12,800 years ago, really suddenly, literally overnight, everything changes. And the Earth is plunged back into a massive deep freeze. This is a time of a huge extinction of species are wiped out. The new evidence that is providing coherent sense to this is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And it has been put forward by a large group of mainstream credentialed scientists. And what they've said is that they have found evidence which suggests the Earth was hit by several fragments of a comet. For a long time, the comet was out there. It was probably a very spectacular visual presence, but it wasn't hitting the Earth. But 12,800 years ago, by which time that comet had begun to fragment and broken up into lots of fragments. And the estimates are that 4 of those fragments, 4 large fragments, hit the North American ice cap. It's literally beyond imagination. That instant of impact would have created so much heat that it would have melted large areas of the North American ice cap and sent the water flooding south. Then within a matter of days or weeks of that release of water, the freezing temperature has begun, and there's no more release of water. The world goes dry at that point and into a very deep, dark, frozen period accompanied by animal extinctions. The Younger Dryas lasts for 1,200 years. It lasts from 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago. And then something else really weird happens. The Earth's been in a deep freeze. Suddenly, 11,600 years ago, you get a second massive pulse of meltwater into the world ocean. One very strong suggestion is that the Earth intersected again with the debris stream of the same comet, and that there were further impacts 11,600 years ago. But those impacts were not on ice. Those impacts were entirely oceanic. You get big comet impacts in an ocean, and what you're going to get, as well as extraordinary tidal waves, what you're going to get is a massive amount of water vapor thrown up into the upper atmosphere. And that water vapor creates a greenhouse effect, which accounts for the very radical warming of the Earth. It has to be rather intriguing that that's the exact date, 11,600 years ago, that Göbekli Tepe is founded. And it has to be even more intriguing that 11,600 years ago is the exact date that Plato gives us for the destruction and disappearance beneath the flood of the ocean of the lost civilization of Atlantis.
If what Graham Hancock is telling us is true about the Younger Dryas, where can we see evidence elsewhere on the planet?
The flood also did sink many other areas of megalithic architecture, such as the gorgeous pyramid that we see in the Azores off the coast of Portugal, what we see around the coast of India, is what we see in Japan, where you have sunken architecture down there, all kinds of stuff that's coming up that defies a conventional view.
As a matter of fact, just a couple of years ago, a little further away from Malta in the Sicily Channel, was discovered a giant, absolutely nobody's disputing, man-made megalith lying on the bottom of the ocean. And that bit of ocean was covered by the rising sea levels more than 9,000 years ago, which makes it already 3,000 to 4,000 years older than the established date for the monumental temples on the island of Malta itself.
Some experts, like Jack Carey, have done some alternative research that might coincide with the science behind the Younger Dryas.
As far as the sunken pyramids go in the oceans of the world, a lot of that can be tied to research being done by Dr. Courtney Brown and his group of very skilled remote viewers. And they're beginning to not only target what they described as being Atlantis, but through their remote viewings, they're beginning to ascertain that it was this very science that caused the downfall of the society, that they used it in such a way that it literally caused a destruction of the landmass, and that may have actually been part of some sort of conflict or war that was going on. The fact that there's just so many of them all around the world is what's fascinating. Humanity has not come together in any way, shape, or form the way we would want or hope or expect or love for it to do ever since the Tower of Babel, ever since we were spread all over the earth.
A conflict? What kind of conflict could Dr. Courtney Brown and his researchers be picking up on? Ancient texts from the Greek philosopher Plato explain in great detail the destruction of Atlantis by Zeus as payback for human arrogance. The legend describes the founder of the great city to be half god and half human, and ruled by Poseidon. As punishment for their immoral bankruptcy, Zeus sent a ball of fire to destroy the aquatic cities. The curator of the Joseph Campbell collection draws some parallels from Plato's story and a similar tale between two warring Sumerian gods.
It is very possible that the Greek story, the one we find in Plato about a lost continent, Atlantis, ruled over by Poseidon, the god of the oceans, that this has earlier roots. After all, storytellers in those times borrowed from other stories, and we can follow. It's called syncretic, the way information, images, and narratives move from one culture to another, particularly if they're relatively geographically close by, which in this case is true. Sure, Enki, the great god of the Sumerian traditions, could have been the Poseidon figure, and the destroyer god could have come from the Sumerian tradition. This is not only possible, it is likely. Zeus is the name we are familiar with from the Greek tradition that comes and punishes the people of Atlantis who have achieved so much because they started taking it for granted.
What could the people of Atlantis have taken for granted? How could they have become immorally bankrupt? Could this be another interpretation of a god figure striking down upon humans for knowing too much?
What I can tell you is that there is a recollection in Sumerian myth and tradition of a time before the flood, when a high civilization existed and when cities existed, and then the flood came and everything was reset and started again. So what's of interest to me in that is the recollection of the memory of something before the flood, something major, something important before the flood.
Could there be a connection between the Greek version of Atlantis and the Sumerian gods?
Je m'intéresse vraiment, mes travaux vraiment se focalisent tout particulièrement. I think it is interesting because we thought for a long time that Plato had been taught by Egyptian priests. But thanks to the Edfu text, we wonder if he actually had the copies in hand. We will never know. But there are very similar elements between the Plato version of the Atlantis and the Egyptian Edfu text of Atlantis I translated. And we can understand in a few words that Osiris, who is considered to be the Sumerian god Enki, fled Mesopotamia to help start a new civilization. According to the doctrine of Enlil, and he flees to Atlantis and settles down on some islands in the Atlantic Ocean. This ancient territory is mentioned in some funerary texts, such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They call it Lab Mata, which can be roughly translated by the water crown of Ta. Ta is one of Osiris's names. It is the Egyptian name for Enki. Like all the other gods, he had many different names. We understand that Ta settles on some islands, and we can identify similar data to that of Plato's writings. In the Edfu versions of the Atlantis, there are always attacks from the forces of Set. Set is, of course, Enlil. We understand that he went all the way to Egypt, even all the way to Morocco, Azores, and the Canary Islands. Set doesn't stop attacking Osiris's islands. Another interesting element to this story, there is a technology that Egyptian gods used for protection, the Djed pillars. They place them around the city. Apparently, some are even on the water. The texts call them floaters. They can protect the city, and we can understand in parts of the text that thanks to the energy coming from these Djed pillars, Egyptians can control water and create water walls, very thick ones, in order to protect the city. Many mythologies and legends have similarities. We understand that Osiris could actually be Poseidon or Neptune, and Enlil, in some ways, could be Zeus.
What is interesting to note is Poseidon is always pictured with a pitchfork that was later connected with the biblical pitchfork of Satan by the Catholic Church. If Enki is connected to this interpretation, could the destruction of Atlantis be the story of Yahweh's wrath on advanced humanity? Anton Parks suggests there is a connection between the scientific version of the Cataclysm and the Egyptian texts.
C'est régulièrement parce que en fait, the Egyptian Atlantis must have lasted long enough in history that it is part of Egyptian culture. Funerary texts mention it quite often. Indeed, the Egyptian Atlantis, Lameta, corresponds to the west. It also means the west in Egyptian. And west is also where you bury the dead. We see that the idea remains that when you go towards the west, there were many deaths. In Egyptian history, Osiris's death happens at the same time as another very singular element, which takes place in the sky. It is the fall of the Eye of Sound found in the Edfu text. This is the destruction of a planet which was in between Mars and Jupiter. This is where we find the asteroid belt, and I believe that a planet used to be there. The death of Osiris is at this point in the story.
In 1950, Immanuel Velikovsky published a book called Worlds in Collision. In this book, he discusses that Venus was ejected from Jupiter as a comet, and this passed near Earth, causing catastrophes mentioned in mythologies around the world. Could Anton's translations of the Sumerian text explain this very moment in human history and how it relates to the flood?
Selon moi, il s'agirait de...
In the Edfu text that I translated, they mentioned the fall of the Eye of Sound. Let me explain. In my opinion, Venus was located close to Mulgay. It was one of its satellites. And when Mulgay exploded, its satellite, Venus, is ejected into the solar system. And at some point, it comes very close to Earth. Then there is Osiris's death. According to the text, this was the work of Enlil, who prepared his attack, both on Earth and in the sky. He really wanted to make history and impact significantly the gods' history. He was not going to be defeated by earthly technology. Venus was ejected into the solar system, turns inside it for thousands of years, before eventually placing itself where it is today. And Leo must have really wanted to finally put an end to the lengthy war he was waging against Enki Osiris. And he came close with the death of Osiris.
Que lorsqu'Isis décide de faire revenir Osiris dans un nouveau corps qui sera le corps d'Horus, dans la Grande Pyramide.
But then a second event, the story tells us, and luckily for history in general, Osiris comes back as Horus, and the battle can start again. There are many elements that explain these events, and that describe how Horus arrives to destroy the evil of the world in order to avenge his father's death. This explains a similar catastrophic event that happened at the same time, such as the destruction of Atlantis. This arrival is most likely a comet, who is actually Horus, according to Sumerian text. And this is also when the so-called flood happened, about 10,000 years ago.
Could these ancient Sumerian texts be explaining a battle for the power over Earth and the destruction not only on the planet, but in the sky? Ancient texts suggest that whoever survived this cataclysm survived to tell the story in Egypt.
Plato tells us where the story came from. It came from an ancestor in his family line, Solon, a famous Greek lawmaker, who visited Egypt around 600 BC. And in that visit, he encountered Egyptian priests who told him the story that there had been a high civilization in remote antiquity that had been destroyed in a cataclysm and submerged beneath the sea, but there were survivors. Some of those survivors came to Egypt and founded what would become the great civilization of Egypt in due course.
And with the great civilizations of Egypt came the Great Pyramid. Could this ancient knowledge that was now buried beneath the ocean floor have made a resurgence on the Earth's surface?
Well, the Great Pyramid, I mean, is a monument, but it's a geometrical monster. But in fact, it's not a four-sided pyramid. It has a very slight concavity on each side, making it an eight-sided pyramid. Now, the minute you do this, you not only complicate the design tremendously, but it produces really bizarre geometry. So this geometry, when we analyze it, produces numbers. Numbers keep popping out. Numbers that shouldn't be there. Things like universal constants.
Up next, could the ancient builders of the Great Pyramid have left behind a code that not even Enlil could destroy? In 1905, physics genius Nikola Tesla submitted his U.S. patent 787412, which was titled The Art of Transmitting Electrical Energy Through the Natural Medium. It included designs for a series of worldwide generators. Tesla realized that the ionosphere was sparkling with electrical energy which could easily be tapped. Planet Earth, according to Tesla, was a gigantic electrical generator spinning around two magnetic poles from which limitless energy can be harnessed using the right medium or shape. His device was later referred to as Tesla's electromagnetic pyramid, based on his design looking like a triangle shape.
Tesla tapping into the actual shape of the pyramid, I believe, was something that just came roundabout through his investigation into the location of the pyramids. Because what it appears to have happened is that he realized that it wasn't the actual shape of the pyramid so much, although pyramids exhibit fractal energy much more efficiently than other types of designs. But what he discovered was it was the location of the pyramids that created the power. And when he built his facility here in Colorado Springs, and then on the East Coast, he did so according to the laws of where the pyramids at Giza were constructed. And it had to do with the elliptical orbit of the Earth and those sites' relationship to the actual equator. That there was an actual construction somehow taking place between those very specific sites and the overall energy field of the Earth. And because of that, he believed he could transmit power wirelessly.
Tesla's discovery and device disappeared after his mysterious death in 1943. But what he was trying to tap into might have just scratched the surface of understanding the power of something much more ancient.
According to Nikola Tesla, 369 is a key to the universe. Tesla became so obsessed with this 369 that he would drive around a building 3 times before going inside of it. He cleaned his place with 18 napkins, lived in hotel rooms only with the number divisible by 3. He made calculations about things in their immediate environment just to make sure the result was conceivable by 3. And he based his choices on the results. He did everything in sets of 3. What is Nikola Tesla trying to make us understand? We must understand that we did not create mathematics. We discovered them. It is the universal language and law. No matter where in the universe you are, 1 plus 2 will always equal 3. Everything in the universe obeys this law. These forms are in nature, but the ancients emulated these forms in construction.
If Nikola Tesla's obsession was with these numbers, and his goal was to define his location and time in space, Could it be possible that ancient humans created monuments like the Great Pyramids to remind us of these truths?
In Sumerian tradition and in the surviving texts, there is a very strong and intriguing reference to what are called the seven antediluvian sages, the seven sages who came before the flood. And their leader is a figure called Oannes. We find that he is depicted as a man, but curiously, he's wearing a sort of fish garb or a fish costume. Archaeologists often refer to him as a fish-garbed figure. And the other seven sages are also dressed in this fish costume. So you see the legs of a human being and the face and features of a bearded human being. But then he's wearing on his head the head of a fish, and the body of a fish hangs down his back. It's a very curious idea, really. And he and all of them hold in their hands a curious little bag, which I tend to refer to as a man bag. I see them as a kind of badge of office, a recognizable symbol where perhaps members of a brotherhood would be able to recognize one another by their carrying of this symbol. It's curious that we see a figure holding the same bag that we see on the Sumerian reliefs and holding it in exactly the same way. And not only that, but those same bags turn up on top of Pillar 43 in Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe, where we know that they're at least 11,600 years old. The tradition is clearly rooted before the flood. Then comes the flood, the cataclysm wipes everything out, but that brotherhood persists through the flood. And after the flood, they are again offering the gifts of civilization to mankind.
Could Oannes and his sages have re-emerged after the cataclysmic flood to teach the knowledge of the universe? In Sumerian cuneiforms, Enki is sometimes depicted as a bearded man wearing a fish costume and sometimes carrying a bag. Interesting to note that in the Egyptian depictions of gods, they are not holding a bag, but an important symbol called the Ankh. The Ankh depicts immortality and life. It is also connected with Isis and the planet Venus. Could these carrying devices be transmitting the same kind of energy? Anton Park's research has traced the re-emergence of Enki to Egypt, and as a byproduct of his death, the building of the Great Pyramid.
La pyramide, je pense, a été créée pour refaire.
In my view, the Great Pyramid was built by Isis. I believe it was created to reincarnate Osiris into Horus. It is quite complicated. The Osirian, the so-called aquatic temple dedicated to Osiris in Abydos, Abaju in Egyptian, means it is located in the city, which is, according to Egyptian history, the first city of Osiris. Yet, to be able to find seashells on a temple located in the middle of the desert, you have to go back thousands of years, at least 10,000 years. Why would he have made such a temple with aquatic features? Because Osiris, who's also Enki, they are the same person, had amphibian genes. Osiris, Enki, was killed by his nemesis Set, who is in fact Enlil, during one of their many battles. It took place in Abydos, which also corresponds to the Sumerian Apsu, where Osiris's aquatic temple can be found. The texts clearly state that all of Osiris's servants were slaughtered during a battle, as well as Osiris himself, who was crucified on a tree. This is how he died. Isis is quite a character. She can't really be found in Mesopotamian literature, although she could be considered the goddess Ninti. She is the woman who lives in the great deeps, underground. I think that these underground passageways could correspond to the ones we can find under the Giza Plateau. We know that the Giza Plateau is full of underground passages. I believe that the clan of Osiris lived there.